Happy holidays, everybody. It is terrific to be back with you on Hospitality Talks. In the hospitality industry, customer service has always been name of the game. The challenges, of course, is in controlling costs while keeping the customer service very high and delivering to the customer expectations. For hoteliers who want to maximize their revenues and return on investments, controlling costs is always top of mind. Measuring cost efficiencies provides useful information on the performance of hotels to management and all stakeholders. The industry has always relied on occupancy percentage, RevPar, margin percentage as traditional measures to evaluate the hotel performance. Today, our panelists will help us understand, are these measures still relevant? And what else needs to be done or looked at to complete the picture of performance for hotels? I'm Abid Butt, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Sam Eric Rutman. Sam.
Thank you. And from my side also, happy holidays to everyone. Uh, if you are viewing for the first time, and you like the content and our discussion, just press subscribe and the notification bell, and you will be then notified duly whenever we are going live. But also, if you are enjoying the discussion and you will have a comment, you please write in a comment, and I will screen them here. So if you have a particular question to one of our guests, that we can then forward that question to them to answer. So in this way, we'll have a livelier discussion. So it's not only up to Abid and myself to ask our guest question, but more importantly, we would like you to be part of this conversation. So if it's all right, let's bring the guests to the screen.
Terrific. So Sam, today we are pleased to have James join us. He is partner and head of asset management team with Ohana Real Estate Investors, with 20 years of hotel operations and asset management experience, holding leadership roles in multiple prestigious hotel companies and brands. He's responsible for the operations of all Ohana investments, maintaining and enhancing the performance through strategic planning and execution. We also have with us David Eisen, who is Director of Hotel Intelligence for Americas, working with HotStats. HotStats, as everybody knows, has a lot of data regarding hotel performance. And I believe David eats, sleeps, devours these stats in his daily routine, looking at global trends as well as to how the monthly performance and benchmarking to the comp sets. That's sort of what HotStats provides. So they have a wealth of information with global presence. So we look forward to finding out from David about the trends. David has been involved in the industry for a very long time and has always had a broader vantage point through his involvement in the industry. David, James, welcome to Hospitality Talks.
Well, I would say thank you for having us. What a fantastic introduction. I like that. Devour the data. I'm ravenous to data, I guess I could say, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic introduction, Abid and Sam. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
David. I've known you for a while, so I thought I could say that. So, if it's okay, we will start with you to understand what trends are there in the industry, David. So, talk a little bit about the overall industry performance. Some few key takeaways as to what 2021 has been like, or any trends that you are noticing.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me on. Happy holidays to everyone. It's nice to put on a sports coat for once and not just come to the office or to my kitchen in sweatpants and sweatshirt. So it's nice to actually put on adult clothing once again. So you're right. I mean, listen, I think everyone at this point understands kind of the I guess call it deleterious impact. Obviously, the pandemic, COVID-19, has had on the hospitality industry as a whole globally. We've seen RevPar, we've seen TreadPar been severely weakened in the wake of the pandemic, and it's had this gigantic impact on the hospitality industry. And I think as we see it, what we're seeing is that now with new strains such as Omicron, although we are hearing that it might not be as, I guess, for lack of a better word, as bad as Delta. Obviously, it's spooked markets. It's caused some travel bans right at the kind of right when it came out, and obviously these new testing procedures. And I think the biggest thing is that anytime there's any kind of restrictions or mandates, anything that makes travel harder, it's always bad for hotels, right? So I think it still remains to be seen, but obviously I think we're done with the new strains. Obviously, we want to get everything back to as normal as quickly as possible. Since we've seen a rapid uptick in occupancy from the beginning of the year, obviously through the summer, hitting its apex in July, we've seen kind of occupancy in the U.S. Has more or less flatlined since the kind of summer. Obviously, and as James I'm sure can speak to, this whole recovery obviously has been leisure led. Leisure. I come from we're a European-based company, so now everyone has me saying leisure instead of leisure. So it's been leisure kind of it's been leisure led, but obviously we'll see if that can be kind of sustained. I don't obviously leisure travel can't sustain the hospitality business for years and years to come. We need to see that pick up in commercial business. We obviously the corporate piece has been off, and it's going to take some time for that to come back. But really, what it's meant from a data standpoint is that revenue pretty much across the board has been around 30% off versus 2019. We've obviously looked to benchmark using 2019 as our baseline, since 2020 was such an anomaly. 2021 is obviously an anomaly too. We've never seen anything like this before. When you take, you could take 9/11, the GFC, put it all together, and there's nothing that's been as impactful in a detrimental way than what's happened with this pandemic. But that's what we're seeing from a revenue standpoint. And I think we'll get into more of it. I wanted to keep kind of my opening kind of short, but obviously there's an expense kind of piece to all this, which I think the good thing we're seeing is that a good thing is that it's kind of a review of cost management. To me, I think COVID-19 is actually, I wrote about this for a piece for a magazine, how I don't think the hotel industry has ever had such an opportunity. This is a great opportunity for the hospitality industry in general to kind of recalibrate, reassess, kind of remanage those expenses. And what we've seen so far is that despite revenue obviously being down across the board, although there are pockets that have done better actually than 2019 levels, which I guess we can get into more. But we've seen that expense side, obviously from the labor perspective, down, and from a total expense management. I do worry that as demand does pick back up, we will see those expenses kind of slide back up. We are already seeing that trend line move up. But I think there's a great opportunity for the hospitality in general to kind of reassess and recalibrate.
Well, David, thank you for that overall picture. Obviously, revenue is the name of the game, and we have come a long ways from the deep, dark dungeons at the beginning of this pandemic, where a lot of the hotels were essentially boarded up. So things are starting to pick up. Now, the expense side of it, if we may spend a little bit of time on that, obviously when the hotels had no business going there because the markets were shut down. You couldn't, even if you wanted to, you couldn't have anybody there. Hotels had to do whatever they did to survive. A lot of people were furloughed at that time. Some of those people have come back. A lot of the services were discontinued. Some of those services have come back. Tell us a little bit about the trends as to what are you seeing from a labor cost perspective, since that continues to be one of the most significant expense items in any hotel?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's the most significant expense in a hotel. You know, more 50% of your kind of overall cost is labor. I mean, listen, it's interesting. I'm based in downtown Washington D.C., and we still see kind of it's almost still a ghost town. And it's interesting. I was looking at kind of the percentage of the number of downtown trips. When you see it like DC, San Francisco, New York, you know, this data is out there. It's so far down year over year that a lot of these major cities, the top MSAs, we're just still not seeing the foot traffic. And I think there's obviously a correlation to the hospitality industry. Offices are still. It's interesting. I look across the street. There's an AC hotel right across the street from. I work at a WeWork. There's more lights on there in those rooms during the day than there is next to the office building next to it. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in the office and what that kind of correlation is. But you know, overall, the U.S. cost base it remains stunted, and obviously that starts with payroll. We've seen October 2021 numbers versus October 2019. Labor is still down. Total payroll on a per available room basis is still down around 37%. You take obviously looking at 21 versus 2019. And obviously labor is still the single greatest threat to the opportunity, beyond filling beds, beyond getting back to meetings, beyond filling restaurants, filling convention spaces. Labor is still the biggest difficulty. I did a little bit of research before coming onto the show to show that I can actually still Google pretty well. But we're looking at some Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and obviously, average hourly wages have gained considerably since 2019, particularly in the leisure and hospitality segment. And preliminary data points to hourly wage all employees. So we're looking at in November 2021, average this is for all employees. The average hourly wage in the leisure and hospitality space is around $19. It was $16 back in 2019 and $17 in 2020 in November. So we're seeing a kind of uptick in from an hourly wage standpoint, and we're seeing that because there's this labor crunch. It's so much more difficult to actually bring labor into the hotel. But there's such a weird kind of dichotomy going on. It's very oxymoronic because you see that there's so many job openings in the hotel segment, but we still hear of this kind of labor crunch. So it's still hard to get people to fill these positions. I think there were about 1.5 million job openings as of September of this year within just the hospitality industry. And that was 60% more than at the same time in 2019. So there's obviously this big mismatch at the moment to the jobs available and the workers wanting to come back and work. Obviously business owners, small business owners, hotels complain that they can't find enough workers. But when they do, that pay is rising so rapidly. But it's to your point, Abbott, about customer service. It's having a huge impact on the overall guest experience. I know, I went out to dinner with my wife over the summer at a nice restaurant right on the water, but they had sections that they couldn't even staff, so they were taking tables out of inventory out basically, so we couldn't sit there. So that's a revenue loss because they literally have enough staff to kind of to staff it. I read this line: from the White House to the local Waffle House is a struggle to understand really what's going on. And there's this kind of whole idea about the Great Resignation or the Great Reassessment. I think job openings obviously are outnumbering job seekers, but obviously people are there's this kind of shift that people are like, I'm not going to come back. I think there's still worry over obviously when you're working at a hotel is not a remote kind of place to work. You can't work at a hotel from your couch, right, or your kitchen table.
Yep.
On front line. So there's kind of mismatch what's going on. So obviously labor's the biggest I think obviously hurdle for hotels right now, particularly as demand comes back, and we see that. So labor's obviously and James can give anecdotally. He sees it, I'm sure, right in his hotels every day.
So, David, have you guys been able to draw some sort of a correlation or impact, if you would. Obviously, in mature markets, the wages are going up, whether we like it or dislike it. In some cases, I think it was needed for the industry. Have you
Yeah.
seen the impact of productivity gains versus wage increases as to net? What does that result in?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but I would say I just think the whole entire labor kind of situation been put on its head. When you look at, what's going to happen with housekeeping, we've seen obviously housekeeping payroll is down because I think there are less hours for housekeepers in general. And I think we're seeing things from the customer service standpoint where your room isn't going to be clean. The expectation used to be, and it was just kind of taken for granted, that your room, it didn't matter if it's a luxury hotel, a full service hotel, a mid-scale select service hotel, your hotel room would be clean on a daily basis. That's not the expectation anymore. Well, I don't know if it wasn't the expectation right when the pandemic happened, right? I think people were like, hey, don't even come into my room. I don't want anyone in there, But I think as we kind of move past through the pandemic and move past this, we're seeing, maybe there is that expectation for daily cleanings, but I think the hotels in general, from a cost standpoint, are like, your room might be clean maybe every third day, or maybe only on check out and check in. So I think it just gets back to kind of this guest expectation versus what the hotels can actually provide for the guests because of this kind of labor situation, the kind of this entire kind of recalibration of it all.
Okay.
I don't know
Well,
if that
look,
answered your question, but that's something that I've observed.
fair enough. I think that might be a good correlation because, to be honest, I've had lots of these conversations where, because of all the changes in amenities and services that were provided, and
Yeah.
because of customer expectations, the margins were pretty healthy. Now, some of those margins are going to get taken away as the wages go up or as some of the services
Right.
are brought back in. So that'll be a good analysis to have. But I'll turn it over to Sam in a second. But before I do that, are there any similarities that you're seeing looking at from global cost perspective, whether it's Americas compared to Europe, Asia, Middle East? Are you seeing any similarities about the cost containment or cost creep, for that matter?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty similar globally. I think obviously if you go back to 2020, if you recall, in March was really when the proverbial I can't cuss on the air, but the what hit the fan. When we saw that kind of breakdown there, but we saw Asia Pacific drop off first, obviously, because everything, and it kind of moved west from there, but they came back quicker, faster. But we saw, in Europe, they had the lockdown, so it was a real struggle there. I'll say this, listen, I was looking at data for October in the UAE. So if you look at a place like Dubai, and I think this is a great story globally, but and this is obviously something that's event driven. So in Dubai, they just started in October the World Expo 2020. They saw, and that's like a 182-day event that was postponed obviously from 2020. Even though it's 2021, still calling it World Expo 2020. Go figure. But they saw a huge pop in occupancy in October, and it translated into higher revenues. But the interesting point is that their revenues were up in the month. Their expenses were still down, right? So their total, their labor costs were still stunted. And when you have that nice kind of mix of revenue and expense, their gross operating profit on a per available room basis, GOPAR, which we call it in the industry, obviously, was up 5% in October 2021 versus the same time in October 2019. So I think from a global standpoint, the trends are very similar. I mean, obviously, it's still a difficult operating environment. I mean, we looked at data. If you look at the data, generally speaking, you've seen it from the forecasters. From a revenue standpoint, it can take, when there's a huge kind of crises like this, it can take as much as 4 years to get back to that kind of revenue standpoint from pre-pandemic. And on a profit scale, it can take as many years. Now, I'm a little bit more bullish. I think we'll get back. It just, hopefully, it's the proverbial. This was the kind of proverbial black swan event that everyone talks about but hopes to sidestep. But obviously, it didn't happen that way. It just remains to be seen how quickly kind of the big conferences get back, corporate travelers get back on the road, if their companies, what the kind of dynamic is there, remote working. Listen, these Zoom calls are great. Even I've been to a few conferences. There's nothing better than being to face. I mean, funny thing, I was watching. It was funny to watch a Zoom meeting between President Biden and President Putin in Russia, and how if you watched it, how wooden it was. It's so like you can't have a relationship, through a screen, and particularly when two global powers are talking. I'm not President Biden and speaking with you guys, and you guys obviously are Putin, but you know what I mean? To have that face-to-face, that tete-a-tete through a screen, it just doesn't translate. Even looking at it now, I have this kind of like, I'm speaking, but my mouth is moving at a different kind of, point. It's just, it doesn't translate, as you know, face-to-face.
Well, look,
I think once it gets back to that.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, technology has bridged a lot of things, but it's not going to be able to replace the personal contact. That's
Never, yeah.
how business is conducted, or has been at least. Now, some of that will change over a period of time because we've all gotten used to living in screens and in this cyber world. But I don't think it's going to be completely replaced. David, let me turn it over to Sam, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, David, you talked about hotels need to recalibrate, and I thought I have seen somewhere about, perhaps it's your article or someone else's article from HotStats who wrote about some best practices. There was kind of a list of things that hoteliers is good for them to kind of look into. I hope I don't cut you off guard, but could you share maybe some of your, maybe something from that list or some pointers that you recommend hoteliers to look at?
Yeah, Sam, I wish you had shared that article with me prior to getting on the air. Listen, I don't want to put a plug in for our company, but overall, and I will just say, listen, I work for a benchmarking company, right? Obviously, there's a lot of benchmarking data companies out there. But I would just say in general that having a clear, there's never been better data for the industry as a whole, right? From a revenue side, from an expense side, from a profitability side. I mean, looking at flow through, looking at flex. I mean, you have all this data in front of you. I think consulting data is very important as we come through this, to really be able to see, okay, here is my cost base versus vis-a-vis my competition. I mean, to know to have that data in your hands and be able to make kind of decisions in real time. I think there's nothing better than that. We talk about data being kind of like being your GPS in your car. When you get in your car, you put in the inputs. I'm trying to get from A to B. How do I get there? Well, data benchmarking basically is your GPS right there. Now, generally speaking, I think obviously any management, a third-party management company operator worth its salt is obviously going to be very focused on expense. I think one of the things that maybe in the past, I think a lot of operators, and I think obviously, and this is kind of being a legacy that a lot of operators are incentivized on just the top line, growing revenue, growing rooms revenue, really focus on that only. I think that more and more now owners are holding their management company's feet to the fire and say, okay, you might be doing great on the revenue side, but what about the expense side, right? How are you wrangling your food cost of sales? Are you, one of the things is obviously is going back to your vendors and maybe kind of renegotiating your pricing on whether it's from cleaning supplies, whether it's your linens, your smallware, your bedding, whatever it is. It's really kind of putting a clear focus on those costs. I think there's an opportunity to, obviously we're still kind of at the tail end of budgeting season, but some companies getting back to zero-based budgeting. Things like that. I think there's just really putting a microscope to every kind of line item to see, okay, here's where I am vis-a-vis last year. How can I improve on this? Because at the end of the day, you're looking at things. When we talk about things like flows, is how your incremental gains in profit versus your incremental gains in revenue over a period of time. Basically, how much money is flowing down to the bottom line. So if I have a dollar and end up with 50 cents on the bottom line, I mean, there's obviously that dollar goes through all these expenses, and at the end of the day, the owner is the last one getting paid out. And one of my refrains has always been RevPar doesn't pay the rent, right? So I think it's really just focusing on your focusing really on your costs and really kind of digging into every single line item to see how you can improve, broadly speaking.
Yeah, great. You have talked also about the hotel revenue is not created equally.
Yeah.
And perhaps you can share your views on this about RevPar and net RevPar for viewers.
That's a great question. Hey, net RevPar, right? I think I was at an event a few months ago, and one of the things they really were pushing was this idea of all revenue not being created equal. And I think it's a great line. It's true. All revenue is not created equal. So you have I think one of the KPIs that I think a lot of hoteliers should really be focused on is net RevPar, which is rooms revenue net of cost of sales. So obviously there's all these commissions, group commissions, fees, reservations expenses. We've always talked about the online travel agencies and what they bring to the table. Obviously they do bring a wealth of bookings, of marketing of your hotel, but there's a huge kind of cost to that, can be as much as 20%. So if you're selling a room for $100 and you're only seeing $80 of that, well, maybe from a revenue management perspective, you need to revisit that. Now, I will say overall, so I think net RevPar is a very important KPI. The one interesting point about kind of trend during the pandemic that we didn't see after 9/11, we didn't see after the GFC, was that hoteliers, I think, have really stuck to their guns and held rate, as opposed to the heavy kind of discounting we saw in crises of past. And what that does is, there's a study I pointed to that Cornell put out years ago, but it still holds true that obviously RevPar is better, ADR, is better led by ADR basically. So it's almost better to sacrifice occupancy to keep that rate higher, because obviously, as you know, the more you discount, the more you lower your rate, the harder it is to get back to that rate. The longer the tail is on that. So I think one of the interesting parts about what happened during this time around is that hoteliers, revenue managers, I think, made the right decision. And regardless of the situation or predicament, they really, I think, position their hotels from an ADR standpoint much better than they did in years past. But yes, net RevPar, big focus on that, and looking at your cost when you're selling that room, because obviously there's not just the the cost, the distribution cost, but obviously servicing the room. I mean, there's so many costs that come into play just for that, selling that room for $100. Now, I know when James comes on, he sells his rooms for $500 plus a night, even more, right, for those great resorts that he has. So you can talk to that. But it's interesting to see that kind of from a rate standpoint. I think hoteliers have done much better this time around in terms of saying, okay, well, and that's the thing though, in a pandemic, it doesn't matter how much a room costs. It costs $10, it costs $100. No one's traveling if they don't feel safe or they're worried about that. So right. It made no sense at all to discount this time around.
Great. Terrific. Thank you very much, David. And over back to you, Abid.
David, one last question before we bring James up. The operating departments, they've always been able to fluctuate the cost points. Some of the things that are typically beyond the hotel's direct control, whether it is real estate taxes or insurances or utility costs, have you seen anything relative to that? Are they going up? They're going down? A lot of the jurisdictions have no money, so you can be guaranteed that they're going to try to bump up the real estate taxes. Any thoughts on that?
So I would say that our data, so HotStats, we our data, we have a wealth of data, 500 KPIs, but all the way down to GOP. So we don't go beyond the GOP line. So I can't speak to much of that. More data is more operationally kind of focused. But like you bring up a good point, things like utilities, obviously there's a variable cost to that. But those expenses from utilities are obviously, they're lower than they were pre-pandemic. But I think from an expense standpoint, I think the thing to recognize is that these costs are down year over year now. But if you look at any of the trend lines I see in the data, they're inching back up, and they're kind of lock in step with how we're seeing occupancy come up. Now, obviously, occupancy is still weakened. I mean, we didn't get into. I know we don't have time. We didn't get into some of the actual locations wise, but like we have seen, and James will be able to speak to it. We've seen resort areas. We've seen some of these kind of the select service extended stay segment do right. I mean, places like Key West, for general, Key West per se has been higher. They've done better in 2021 than they did in 2019. So we're seeing that some pockets have done extremely well during this pandemic. Others, Washington D.C., where I sit, have done, let's not sugarcoat it, done horribly. It's been such a difficult operating environment. But yeah, from a cost standpoint, we're seeing those costs, sneak back out, and that's the worry. I think we always talk about. A lot of hotel owners always talked about brand creep and amenities creep, and how the brands, pushing kind of brand standards down their throats sometimes. But we are seeing a little bit from a creep standpoint, the cost creep coming back into the P&L statement. And I think it's incumbent upon hoteliers. These costs I think it's a good thing. If expenses do come back, that means I think the hotel industry in general is doing better, right? They have to come back at some point. But it's making sure to keep, as before, to keep really a kind of vigilant eye on all these expenses to make sure that they aren't ballooning in the ways they were maybe in the past.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for that. Please stay with us. We'll have you back in a moment. But at this point, I'd like to bring up James. James, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Of course. Thank you, Abed, and thank you, Sam, for having me.
Well, you have a wonderful portfolio of some gorgeous resorts, branded, independent. You have a better presence in urban locations and a lot of resorts. Tell us what the recovery has been for you in your portfolio.
Sure. I think, like David said, I think across the nation, we're looking at about 70% recovery to 2019. In our portfolio for 2019, we're actually back to about 100%. And that's largely driven by and I've been practicing this while David was talking, but that's largely driven by our leisure guests. That leisure component to our business has been a significant component for a very long period of time. It was something that we focused on prior to leisure travel even really being talked about the way it's talked about now. So we're fortunate that we have seen recovery back to 2019 levels across the portfolio. But I will say that in the portfolio, we're seeing variations from anywhere to 80% of 2019 levels to 140% of 2019 levels. I would tell you that as we kind of map out what we believe 2022 to look like, we're hitting about 120% of 2019 levels as well. And that's largely driven by leisure. But that 120% only comes back if the group demand comes back and if business travel starts to come back as well.
So, James, you slipped up and you said leisure. So just wanted to point that out.
I had it written down, so I didn't mess it up, but I guess I lost it.
Look, while we have discussed a great deal about the labor, and David had pointed out some of the trends, but before we get there, any changes you're seeing relative to customer expectations or customer demands that are different than what pre-pandemic might have been? Now, some of the simple stuff we've talked about, whether housekeeping needs to be daily service or not, and a lot of people are at this point are saying, stay out of my room for safety reasons or whatever else the case might be. But have you seen anything else that is sort of entrenched in how we operating our hotels today?
Yes. One thing that is certainly here, and I'm not sure how long it will be here for, I think we may move back towards kind of quote unquote normal or pre pandemic normal, but the value proposition for the customer has changed. They're valuing the ability to travel in and of itself as opposed to valuing the individual things that are taking place while they're traveling. And so what that has done is it's created space for a hotel operator to be able to provide a clean room, a safe environment, and and the ability for that customer to travel. But that in and of itself historically was not necessarily considered part of the value proposition. That was just table stakes. And I think that that's starting to be valued more. Another trend that we're seeing is that there is a desire at this moment in time to be independent in your travel. So whether that means that you can walk across the front drive and past the front desk and directly to your room through mobile check-in, or whether that means you're sitting by the pool and can hit a QR code and have a margarita get delivered to you and close out the check all on your mobile device. I think that some of those things are probably here to stay, and the customer will ultimately decide how much they want to utilize that type of option.
So that's a great segue, James. How much of going forward, how much of what we do is influenced by technological advancements? You talked about this platform where you can order online and pay without having to absolutely be interacting with a staff member. Are there other examples that are becoming must-have, not only from guest service point of view, but also from cost containment perspective?
Yeah, look, technology has always been around that could do what I just described, right? That's been here for the last really 5 years and almost a decade in some cases. I think the adoption rate is what has changed. I think that people are willing to now start to pick these things up because of other factors, such as fear, such as a desire to travel more efficiently. And I think those factors are what are pushing customers towards what I just described. I do think that there are other technological advances that will come up in the relatively near future. I think you're seeing some, flashy cover stories around robotics and how that can start to influence the hotels. I've seen them in hotels, and right now it's more of a talking piece and a point of interest, and less so is something that you're going to rely on from a cost control standpoint. But I can see that changing out into the near future. I also think that there's certain technologies, particularly around environmental controls and kind of reducing your carbon footprint, that are going to come to the forefront. I think that building management systems of old are starting to transition, and you're seeing some capital dollars get put into, HVAC and chillers and BMS building management systems in order to have a more efficient building. And that will ultimately help draw down your utility costs as well. There's also technological advances with water control, and I think that will be a focus as well.
Fabulous. One last question before I hand it over to Sam at this particular point. James, talk a little bit about the labor challenges. I know there is an acute shortage of availability of skilled labor. How have you been dealing with it? And same thing that I was talking to David about, wage increases versus productivity gains. Net, have you seen any major benefit, drawback? Can you shed some light on that? And what have you been able to do to attract the talent and make sure that they're able to deliver the services?
Yeah, it's a very important topic right now, and the past 2 years has been probably the toughest on anybody that has worked on the ground in the hotels. And having done so, I empathize with those that are in the operation at this moment and over the past, like I said, 18 months to 2 years. It's always challenging to leave a job, and I think we've seen a significant amount of people depart from the industry, and that's saddening. But at the same time, I think it opens up the door for a new type of employment experience in the hospitality industry. And so what we're having our properties really focus on, and we're partnering with the brands and the operators to make sure that we're doing this as efficiently as possible. But we want our properties to be the employer of choice in any market that they're in. So table stakes for that means that we are paying market level wages, right? That's what everybody should be doing. But after that, it's about how do you attract the talent into the building? How do you retain that talent once you have attracted it into the building? And then ultimately, how do you make sure that somebody has an enjoyable, fulfilling, and hopefully, long career in hospitality? And that's where we're focused. I'll give you an example of how we're trying to do something that's a little bit unique in the industry. We're instilling retention bonuses at one of our properties, and so oftentimes when somebody in the industry talks about bonuses, they're talking about executive pay, they're talking about corporate pay. At times, they're talking about middle management bonuses. But what we're talking about is true retention bonuses for everybody, from the person that's washing your dishes to the person that's making your bed, and that's something that we believe is going to be very powerful. And it's not just a pure, here's a dollar if you stay longer than what we thought you were going to stay. It's tied to actual metrics that really help productivity, improve profitability, and improve overall guest experience. And so there are certain thresholds that have to be met from a profit standpoint, from a guest experience standpoint. Once those profits are met, then that retention bonus increases. And so what we're finding is that the initial feedback from the staff is incredible. They understand the metrics, they are excited about them, and they see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. And so being creative in how you're able to retain the talent that you already have is really important. In any one of these markets, there are enough ladies and gentlemen that can fill one hotel, right? They may not be able to fill 25 hotels in the market, but if you become the employer of choice in that market, your difficulty around attracting and retaining talent starts to fade.
Well, fabulous, and kudos to you and your organization for putting this bonus scheme in that takes into account all staff at a hotel. Typically, honestly, it's been executive level teams, and even at that, most of the time, the goal has always been not to have to pay out the bonuses rather than the other way around. A lot of times, these bonuses have become a demotivator rather than a point where you can get people aligned and focused on one thing. Thanks for sharing that, James. Let me turn it over to Sam, and I'll be back with you in a moment. Sam.
Yes, thank you, Abid. And James, thank you very much for being part of this discussion. Before I ask you my question, I just want to ask our viewers any questions or any comments that you have. Please write them down in the comments, and we will make sure that we are showing them to our panelists or our guests. But my question, I want to move over to about asset management, because we have also many university students who are studying and they are entering into a career. What is the day of an asset manager these days when you are looking at or managing such large assets like you are? Just giving a sort of a down-to-earth, is it looking at the screens every day, or is it meeting hotel operators on monthly or quarterly basis to the sparring sessions? What is it all about?
James, only the good parts.
Only the good parts. Good. Well, first, I start my day by picking up the phone and calling David, because I agree with him that it starts with the data, right? We're very, very focused on the data. I would tell you that a day in the life at this moment in time, I mean, we're sitting in December, so we all know what we're negotiating right now, right? We're all trying to figure out what 2022 budgets are going to look like. But kind of peeling back there and kind of going a little bit more back in time, my team started traveling in June of 2020. And so I'm a firm believer in setting up a cadence on property. That's how it was set up for me when I was on property. And I believe that cadence is critical. And, as an asset management profession, once we started to ask our executives to go back to work and be in those hotels, I felt that it was important that our team got back on the road as well and was able to meet those executives on their properties to make sure that we were being as supportive as possible. I was brought up in the industry very much in the form of servant leadership, and I still believe in that very strongly today. So yes, we are having monthly meetings on property. We talk to our general managers probably in most cases daily, in some cases multiple times a day, depending on what's taking place. We want to be there to support them and make sure that they have all the tools at their disposal to be as successful as possible. You know, when we go through a period of disruption like this and similar during the financial crisis, there's a moment in time for you to start to steal market share. And we have certainly deployed a strategy against that, and we're acting on that. But you can't just talk about it. You can't just have a Zoom about it. You have to be actively involved with the revenue management profession, with the general manager, with the rooms executive, and everybody has to be on the same board. And at times, it takes looking someone in the eyes to know that everyone is aligned.
Oh, that's terrific. Yeah, there has been always an issue about what actually does the asset manager do, and I think you are describing it very well, and that means really that meeting the people who are running the hotels on your behalf, which makes a huge difference. I think criticism about hotels has been that people are nowadays, consumers are really expecting that hotels and other consumer industry should be like an app, which are updated. You know, these apps are, if you have an iPhone or Android, your app is being updated every week. You're getting something new, which is more improved. How do you see the hotel industry? Do you see that something better that the hotel industry can do now, or to be like almost like an app, that there's always something new, innovative coming up? And is that question being raised by hotel property? What was the last thing you innovated?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't heard hotels compared to an app before, but I understand kind of what you're saying, and I'll kind of zero in on a criticism in hotels that is as old as time, right? The restaurants within a hotel are hotel restaurants, therefore they're uninteresting, and they have, you know, they're a necessary, they're a need. They're not necessarily something that you desire. So if you go to any main street or any downtown area and you have an independent restaurant, that restaurant is getting updated every 3 to 5 years, whether it's an FF&E package, whether it's a concept change, whether they go out of business and somebody else comes in. You know, I think that is something that we can certainly improve upon. We have multiple hotels that have popped up different concepts within their properties over the past few years. Some of that was out of necessity, right? I think dining outside became something that everybody really needed to be able to do. And so if you can provide that flexibility for your customer, you become more attractive than the hotel down the street. And so I do think that there's an age of innovation coming through the hotels. I use the restaurants as an example, but I also think that there are public spaces that sit dormant that can be monetized in one way or another, whether that's through a membership program, whether that's through kind of just reusing the space and finding the highest and best use. But every time we either make an acquisition or, you know, are looking at buying a hotel, I'll walk through the hotel with our team, both the investments and the asset management team, and we'll find places that have been underutilized for decades at times. And we try to find value where others have seemed to have ignored it for a period of time.
Yeah, thank you. That's terrific. Amit, any final questions you have?
Yeah, one more question before we bring David back into the conversation. James, how are these conversations relative to brand standard, cost containment, revenue generation? How are these conversations different today than they might have been pre-pandemic time?
It's a great question, Abid. I think it goes back to some of the GOP conversation that we were having with David. And I think that, you know, we set new high watermarks from a profitability standpoint during this pandemic. And so we now have the ability to look at where GOP was pre-pandemic, where we were able to get to GOP, oftentimes due to unnatural forces around labor, and then trying to figure out what is the right spot for us to now calibrate to. And I think once we're able to do that, ultimately the hospitality industry could become more profitable than it was pre-pandemic. The beauty of our industry is that we have the ability to reset rents on a nightly basis, and we have the ability to change menu pricing on a nightly, weekly, monthly basis if that's what we choose to do. And I think the recalibration of pricing associated with the increased, you know, cost pressures is important. And I think that there are some people that are surgical about being able to do that. And then there are other people that just take broad sweeps across, across revenue or room rates. And we plan on being the group that is more surgical than others, and hopefully we can, achieve more market share because of that.
Fabulous. Well, Sam, let's bring David back into the conversation. But James, a question for you: with the wealth of data that is available to us, I hope that people are more focused and more surgical, using your terminology, as opposed to one size fits all mentality that might or might not work. Any thoughts on that? Any best practices that you can share where, it wasn't all that long ago, to be honest, that this data was not available to us. And now that we have gotten this information, is it being better utilized? Are we making smarter decisions today? Any thoughts, James?
Yes, great question. From a best practices standpoint, what we try to do is we will pull from our proprietary database where we have over 1,000 hotels and try to understand in any given market what is an optimal profit margin, right? And we'll line up 7 hotels in some cases across that market and be able to say, out of all of the different components to that P&L, this is what we think is the right number that our property should be performing at. What we then do, and this may get into the best practices part, is we sit down with the director of finance, the director of sales and marketing, the general manager, and we share this data with them. And we help them understand why we have the expectations that we have. And a pretty magical thing happens where that executive team ultimately wants to win as well. So once they realize what the scoreboard is, they're trying to put up better numbers than the next property. And that's been a very powerful strategy that we've been employing for the last 5 years.
Superb. Hey, David, a question for you. Benchmarking is the best thing since sliced bread, I think, anyhow, because you're far more knowledgeable. Having said that, it does have a bit of a negative to it because it can be raced to the bottom. Your thoughts?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I appreciate the plug, and obviously, I don't know if so much a race to the bottom. I think that there's no kind of the data that's available. I look at it like data is the new kind of big data is the kind of new oil, so to speak. I wrote about that before, kind of the understanding of it. I think there's an education behind data, right? Like it's okay, here's the data, but to James's point, what do you do with the data? I think it takes a holistic approach. It's obviously, it's not just one person silo, it's a team approach. It's a total buy-in. But I think if the data is available, I think that owners particularly, because our focus, our ethos has always been on profitability. And that's for really a focus on the owners. And I think that they have the tools available now to kind of, like I mentioned before, now what we can do is help a business, a hotel, like James was saying, from a profit margin standpoint, whatever it may be, there's no kind of setback to it.
So,
and
David, go ahead. Sorry,
I was just going to add to that. Something that we talk about on our team is about how you responsibly use data, as opposed to just taking the data that you have and having it tell you what you want it to tell you. So I think the contextual insights that somebody either coming out of the industry or has been a student of the industry can help provide really allows you to use that data responsibly. So you do get improvement as opposed to a race to the bottom as you described.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the critical thing, James, and thank you for sharing that. As you know, there have been books written how to lie with the stats. And unfortunately, if you took these data points at face value, then it just becomes, for lack of any better words, a pain point. And sometimes I can't get there fast enough. And that's what we all focused on. But thank you for sharing that. David, back to you. A question relative to resource allocation, have you seen, and I'm focusing on acquisition costs, business acquisition costs, or sales and marketing costs, over the years, have you seen any changes relative to that? Is it going up or down? I know for a while we were maniacally focused on costs relative to OTAs, but all in all, are we gaining grounds or are we spending more money for the same business?
Sorry, was that a question for me or for James?
Yes,
I
yes,
think James
please,
would
David,
actually
you.
I think James would be in a better position to answer that than me. I defer to him.
Yeah, well, Abed, I
Nicely
mean,
deflected.
yeah,
Yeah.
I stopped listening once he said David, so I don't know what the question was. No, I'm kidding. Um, yes, I think that people have started to take resources, to David's point earlier about net RevPar, and try to figure out how to push resources towards more profitable and efficient channels. So the best example that I can give you, and everybody probably knows this already, but instead of, you know, paying significant, travel agent commissions, take some of those dollars and apply them towards your infrastructure around your website, or if you have a vanity page, and try to force people to book direct. And it's no more complicated than that, making sure that you have the ability for your customer to actually book and you have a pleasant kind of booking experience. And at times, if you do that, you can see shift, out of the OTAs to book direct, a couple of points at a time, and that makes a big impact on your profitability. Interestingly enough, you don't always see it in your RevPAR number, but it starts to come to life in your profit.
Fair
Can I
enough.
actually ask a question? Can I ask a question, piggybacking off that to James? So yeah, there's obviously that the reallocation of dollars. How much is that is the job of the brand versus the owner of that, right? In terms of, obviously you pay fees to your management company, you pay fees to the brand. How much is it their job to kind of, obviously the brands, over the years have and which is I think a great maneuver, have really gone to that, the book direct when Hilton came out with and Marriott came out, these kind of programs about, a lot of marketing behind that about booking direct. I think it's an educational thing. Obviously, you don't get your loyalty points if you're not booking, through a Marriott channel, Hilton channel, IHG channel, choice, whatever it may be. So how much of that is that focus or that kind of pivot? Is that the brand's job or is that the owner's job, or is it kind of working in tandem together?
It's definitely working in tandem, and this may be an entire separate podcast, but it really goes back to the incentives that were created in a hotel management agreement. So if you have proper incentives where you are going to be in an incentive management fee that's driven off some sort of profitability metric, the brand or the operator is instantly aligned. If that is not the case, then it does fall on the owner to make sure that is a drum that is beaten on a monthly basis. So the on-property team knows that that's an important component of what the owner's expectations are.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I don't mean to hijack it, but we talk about HMAs and kind of, whether it's focused on that profitability component, because you're right, it's all about brand and kind of owner alignment.
Fair enough. We are approaching the end of our time, but Sam, anything from you? I've got a couple of last few questions, but anything that you would like to add?
No, Abed, go ahead. You still have some great questions.
So a question for both of you, and starting with you, David. New disruptors in our industry. What are you seeing?
New disruptors beyond
Yep.
Airbnb? I guess Airbnb is kind of passe now. They're just new disruptors. That's a really good question. I would say I'll say HotStats. I'll plug me. We're a disruptor. We're coming in
Well,
and
in
showing
many ways, the information that you're providing is new, and learning how to use that information would be new as well. Fair enough. It would have been better if James had plugged it for you, but we'll let you get away with it.
I know. Well, James plugged it earlier. Once we get off after this video cast, me and James will have a call, and I know he wants to buy some more data from us anyway. So
I do. I've been a customer since day one.
Yeah.
I think the membership hospitality is in its infancy. I think we've learned that through the pandemic that being a part of something is really important, and being willing to pay to be a part of something or have access to something is something that our target demographic is certainly interested in. So I think as much as we've seen the success around Soho House and others, I think that there is much more to come.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you for that. Last question. Two learnings from this pandemic. David, you go first.
How come I always have to go first? Can't James go first for once? Two learnings. I think obviously being nimble would be one, to really be able to. I'm sure James has stories. I mean, I can't imagine. Obviously, I don't own or run a hotel, but I can't imagine just from day one what happened when you see. We've never seen demand fall off a cliff so precipitously than what happened with the pandemic. Obviously from a commercial side, less so from a leisure side. But I think there's just this idea of having to be nimble from an operational standpoint. Did you ask for two? I think the other thing for me is just to make this point, and I think it's a point that that James has actually ultimately made in a lot of the discussion we've had today. But this idea of and actually JLL spoke about it in a piece a couple weeks ago, I think. This idea of moving our kind of focus always on RevPar and getting into the idea of a focus on TrevPar, a focus on GoPar. From a legacy standpoint, traditionally it's always been RevPar. Every call you have, any on the C corps when their earnings call, it's always focused on RevPar. But I think to James' point, particularly, as a owner of a lot of these big box luxury properties, full service hotels, really kind of focus on maximizing all your space, and that gets into going beyond just the idea of, well, obviously rooms is always going to be the highest revenue generator, but really getting into focusing on those other, whether it's from an F&B standpoint, from its a conference and banqueting, whatever it may be, but really kind of focusing beyond just TrevPar, focusing on TrevPar, focusing on GoPar. I think that's something that I think we all need to have learned through this pandemic.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for that. James, you get the last word. Two learnings from this pandemic.
Yeah, I would say the first learning is that if you're waiting for the pace of bookings to tell you to take a certain action, that pace may not come back as in the same form that you thought it would. And so inaction will actually leave you behind the comp set. Sometimes you have to make an instinctual decision without seeing that pace is recovering. And then secondarily, and more importantly, the relationship between a hotel general manager and the owner or the asset manager is more critical than I ever believed. And I thought it was pretty critical prior to the pandemic. So I'll leave you with that.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. James Cole with Ohana Real Estate Investors and David Eisen with HotStats. It's been a terrific conversation. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Sam.
Yes, I also like to thank David Eisen and also James Cole very much for this very interesting discussion. It's been very helpful, and I also know that many of our viewers who are university students studying the industry will be delighted about what you have shared today. Yes, I'd like to thank all the live viewers who joined us today, and also like to remind you that we have a podcast from this episode, which will be coming out. If you just go to your favorite podcast channel and look for Hospitality Talks, you will find us there, and this will be up in 24 hours after this episode. So I look forward to welcoming you again, either to our next episode here in Hospitality Talks as a video or webinar or what you like to call it, or you can listen to us then as a podcast when you go out jogging in the morning. So with these words, I close this episode. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you very much.
Happy holidays, everybody.
And happy holidays.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.